It was a little green man, a monster.
Hello and welcome to another Bad Movie Review. This time we are talking about Invasion of the Saucermen. This is a 1957 horror-omedy, sci-fi horror-omedy. Runs about an hour and 9 minutes and was approved by the board. It was directed by Cahn and based on the story The Cosmic Frame by Paul Fairman. Now, since this is a science fiction horror comedy, there are some pretty hardcore cliches in here. So we are in the town of Hicksburg, a quiet place that's also quite boring. And we are introduced to our quasi-narrator, Art, who is only really involved peripherally in the storyline, which is kind of weird. But he and his friend Joe are finishing up dinner at a diner and complaining about their luck. It looks like they're kind of quasi-con men or get-rich-quick types, but Joe wants to go out looking for some female companionship, and Artie wants to go back to bed. So he's going to the boarding house and Joe's going out cruising. For some reason, he goes out to the middle of nowhere. Now, of course, you may recognize Joe as Frank Gorshin, famously known as being the Riddler in the 1960s Batman TV show with Adam West. So around this time, a UFO is seen landing. Three young men who were standing outside goofing off happen to see it. One of them, Duke, says he saw a blue flying saucer, but his friend Johnny didn't see it, just a light in the sky is all he saw. They weren't really paying attention to the skies. And Johnny meets up with his girlfriend Joan, and they head out to Lover's Point. Now, an army recruiter happened to be in the area too, and he hears that Duke has seen a UFO, so he skedaddles off. Everybody thinks he's just leaving, but he's actually going to report to his commander. Meanwhile, Old Man Larkin is really upset about all those pesky kids being in his cow field because he owns the land where Lover's Point is. And it was the Lover's Lane long before he owned it, so those pesky teenagers are always coming on his land trespassing, and he's got a shotgun full of rock salt that he's just dying to use. And there's also the fact that the local teenagers also tend to throw beer bottles to Old Man Larkin's bull Walt, who constantly harasses them for free beer. Weirdly, that does come into play later in the story. Now, Joe happened to see the UFO. He's seen it land, and he is convinced there's some shenanigans going on, so he tries to get Artie invested in this to go out and look. Artie doesn't really care at all and is not interested whatsoever. So Joe, who's been drinking slightly from this little bottle that he has tucked in his jacket, is convinced this is how he's gonna get rich. Now, Johnny and Joan are up to something other than making out. They're on their way to what appears to be eloping in a neighboring town, and they're leaving Lover's Point to do that when they accidentally run over an alien. And it's because they didn't have their headlights on because they don't want Old Man Larkin to notice. But once they do that, the alien's hand extends these little needles out and pops their tire. So now they're kind of stuck there because they got this corpse under the front bumper and they've got a flat tire. And it sounds like he may or may not have a spare. It's a little unclear. But Johnny still thinks that they should go call the police. And they do that and the police laugh at them. Also, they sort of broke into Old Man Larkin's house, which is kind of a theme in this one. There's like 3 people going to that guy's house. Things just get weird from there. The military shows up where the spacecraft is, but they don't see the aliens because all the aliens are out and about milling around in the woods. Well, Joe does find the corpse of the alien wedged under Johnny's car, and he tries to take it, but ends up running across the other aliens. Things go a little out of control, and when Johnny and Joan return, they see the aliens banging on his car, and they think that these intergalactic space travelers believe the car killed their friend, so they quietly sneak away. Well, the aliens are super crafty because they're staging a crime scene. They have little fingers with needles on them that pop out and inject people with liquid, which is explained later in the film what that is. They have little eyeballs on the back of their hands, and they can detach their limbs apparently. Whether it will or not, it's a little unclear, but the limbs can act independently, which was very Evil Dead 2. too, but in a slightly goofier way. And when the military try to cut their way into the spaceship, it ends up blowing up. Thankfully, nobody's hurt, but it does kind of strand the aliens. And since the police don't believe the kids, and they're in fact trying to frame them for a murder, the teenagers do run to their friends and try and rally them because they're just crazy kids, see? Of course, the police don't believe them. The police would never believe these pesky kids. So the kids have to rally together to try and fight the aliens, and it turns out to be way easier than you'd think, because although the aliens are immune to bullets, there's one very common thing that's floating around that the aliens are not immune to. So while this movie is obviously meant to be a little bit of a comedy, it does look like at some points scenes were filmed to be straight up horror, because there are some generally creepy moments where this alien hand is trying to eject somebody, and you get these kind of glimpses of the aliens at first, and although they look like a slightly sillier version of the Mars Attacks aliens, they still have like a certain level of creepiness. And when you see the aliens in the shadows or as like the puppets and not people in costumes, they're way creepier than when you see the little people in the costumes, because once they're in the costumes, the proportions are kind of odd because of the size of the heads of the aliens, and they look a lot sillier. But unfortunately, most of the jokes don't land. It's just trying too hard to be silly, and it ends up being a lot like a Marvel movie where as soon as there's tension, they have to let loose with a bunch of lazy jokes to try and relieve the tension and put some weird trombone music in there, and it ends up hurting the movie. Nonetheless, this is one of my favorite 50s alien movies because it is so silly, but the aliens are really cool. They have these great ability to hide from people, they have a goofy weakness, and they also have one of the craziest abilities with injecting people with stuff that makes them totally discredited. And it was just such a brilliant way of doing things that I think the story itself, if played more seriously, could have been a very interesting horror film. Now, this did get remade years later as The Eye Creatures, which I think was a made-for-TV feature, but still, this movie is one of the craziest films of its era. It has all the elements of a horror film, but then they switched it over into a comedy at some point, so it has all these elements of really bad comedy, and it sort of doesn't work for either, but it ends up being this cult classic masterpiece of just bizarreness. And the aliens do look really cool, and there's some great ideas here, but the movie is very, very short. If it had been longer, to about an hour and a half, and treated like a straight horror film, I think it would have been a lot better, but it would kind of kill the time capsule effect that it ends up having, where a lot of sci-fi and horror films of this era really didn't know what they wanted to be. And what's really surprising is the amount of gore in here. There is a scene in here where Old Man Larkin's bull, Walt, ends up fighting with one of the aliens, and it's the best fight scene in the film. But there's some pretty brutal sequences in there, and there is a little bit of gore, which is really surprising for 1957. So I'm not quite sure how this one got approved, but it's definitely a strange film, and I highly recommend watching it because it's got some really creepy elements, but at the same time, it's very, very cheese. And with all the unfunny jokes and silliness of it, it does lend itself well to critique by audiences of the MST3K variety. So if you get a chance to watch this with some friends, it is definitely worth the time to watch. It is a cinematic masterpiece by accident when it could have been a cinematic masterpiece by design. So the acting is largely okay considering what they were trying to do with the silliness here. Lynn Osborn does a good job as Artie, and he's got one of those cartoonish faces that's good at acting and expressing emotion in a over-the-top way, which you would want for a comedy. But again, the comedy elements really fall flat here. And most of the others are pretty stock standard B-movie actors, and they do a pretty decent job. And there are some recognizable people in here aside from Frank Gorshin. So if you've seen enough TV of this era and about the decade afterward, you'll probably recognize a few people. Also, a lot of people from low-budget horror and various other films. And again, that makes it worth watching. I did like the fact that the majority of the movie takes place over the course of one night. And it was obviously filmed at a soundstage, but they did a really good job with the day for night, because most of this movie was filmed during the day, but they used proper filtering to give it some of the best day for night shots that I've ever seen, especially in a movie of this era. So while the music is at times very, very goofy, the cinematography is really, really well done, and the direction is very impressive for this type of low-budget film. I mean, this was usually double billed with I Was a Teenage Werewolf, so you're not having high expectations, but it does work really well. Nonetheless, it is a cinematic masterpiece that deserves to be on the shelf of any fan of sci-fi cheese, especially of this era. But that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future reviews. If you'd like to help the channel out in other ways, links are in the description to various support methods. And as always, we hope to see you on the next one.